Welcome to today's episode of Working Progress. We're thrilled to have two guests with us today, and you might recognize this space. We're back in the Mind Science Center. So our guests today, who will be talking about their brand new book, The 5 Sciences of Self, are Dr. Ron Bonnstetter. Thanks for being with us today. And Ms. Carissa. Carissa, you're a little bit newer to TTI, but you've played an incredible role in the Mind Science Center, and you co-authored this book with Dr. Ron.
That's right.
Tell us a little bit about this experience. Is this your first authoring experience?
This is my first authoring experience. It's been such an incredible ride. I'm just so grateful to have been given the opportunity to be involved with the whole process. And it really gave me the opportunity to kind of take a deep dive into our sciences, which I really appreciated being new to TTI and new to assessments in general. So now I'm just excited to share that in the book that we wrote.
We're going to dig into that in just a second, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask you to tell us just a little bit about yourself. So you've been with TTI for just over a year, I think, at this point, and you spend most of your time here in the Mind Science Center. So how did you get this love for all things assessments and the brain? Because it kind of goes together.
Yeah, definitely. Well, my very first experience with an assessment at all was when I was in graduate school, and I took my very first disc. And so I was in my early 20s, and I had a gigantic moment of self-discovery, essentially, in getting those results. I discovered more about myself and how to describe who I was, and since I took it in a classroom setting, I also learned about others and kind of how they were behaving and why that impacted me in certain ways. So that was my first taste of assessments in general. So once I made it to TTI and started off as office coordinator, so I got to know kind of the assessment space in general, work with everybody on the team, and then I was brought over into the research division. So I'm really excited to serve now as the research technician. I love diving into human behaviors and understanding why people do the things they do. So that's kind of what got me really excited, and now I'm here and excited to just continue to contribute.
And you're in good company. This entire organization is full of people who I like to say geek out over those types of things.
And she's not even really hitting on all the talents, but even you have to read some of the background of her and her bio so you can see that she has advising background and all kinds of skills, and her writing skills really shine in the book.
They did. You did an excellent job.
Thank you.
You did a great job. And Dr. Ron, you're no stranger to TTI or to the assessment side of things or the brain side of things, but tell us a little bit about your experience with this specific writing assignment. You've written hundreds of articles and pieces, but how was this? How did it go?
Well, when Ron Price asked me to consider doing this, it seemed overwhelming. And then as I thought about it, though, we really have spent over 7 years working on this. Because what we were able to do is we took each of our 5 sciences, and I had already written chapters in Dr. Eric Garrick's books on our technical reports. So we already had technical reports that had a chapter on the history. And by the way, if you really want to see more than this in this book, you need to go to those technical reports.
No, that's it. That should come with a disclaimer. Those things are intense. It's incredible, but prepare yourself. It's not like reading this book.
No, and that's why this book was so important, because unless you are a real nerd, you may not want to read the technical reports, or an academic or something. But this is actually, our intent was to take and make this really exciting and readable and understand the 5 sciences.
Mm-hmm. So let's dive in just a little bit, because we don't want to give everything away, but it is called the 5 Sciences of Self. So we're assuming you tackle 5 different sciences. So the first is probably the most well-known science in the assessment industry, which is DISC, and that's the behavior of how you do things, right? Anything we want to talk about more than just that?
Yeah, I think, first of all, recognizing every one of these chapters, to have a good assessment, they have to have a theory base and a foundation that is grounded in research. And so the history is really the grounding that we create in each of the 5 chapters. And in particular, it's a story. And it's a beautiful story because we get to talk about all the key people in history. I think most people that use DISC will associate Marston with that, but there's so much more than Marston. And Marston wasn't really even the initiator. I think one of the ahas for me in putting the material together, personally, was uncovering the hidden gems that were behind some of these assessments. And I ran across a gentleman by the name of Prescott Leakey, who never finished his PhD. He wrote 5 dissertations, threw them all away because they weren't good enough.
Oh my.
He was actually working with Marston. He was at Columbia. And the only reason I was able to discover his work associated with behaviors was after his death, his graduate students all got together and wrote and took all their notes and put them together to write about this man's contribution to behaviors.
Wow.
So these kinds of stories are just, I don't know, I get excited about the story behind the story.
Of course. And I have a question about that, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes. One of your personal stories behind the story. But talk to us a little bit about, okay, so we have DISC, that's number 1. Number 2 is motivation.
Yeah.
What's that?
Yeah, motivation. What I love most about digging motivation is just for how long the theory of motivation has been studied. So we really unpack that in the book. And then as far as it being applied into our assessments, it's finding out what really drives you. It's almost that underlayer of the DISC. It can inform why someone is behaving a certain way because they're motivated by different drivers in their lives.
Mm-hmm. For me, that one is the biggest aha, right? Because it's like, well, I understand why, who Carissa is and how she's going to behave, but why are you doing that? Why are you driving me nuts? And it's that motivation piece. Okay, so motivation and behaviors, and then emotional quotient. That's a buzzword these days, EQ.
Yeah, well, emotional quotient really is just looking at the emotional components of our behaviors. And what's exciting about that from my perspective is that in my neurological work that we'll talk, I hope, a little bit about, I started to discover that every decision we make has an emotional component. Every decision. It can be positive, it can be negative, it can be neutral, but we are driven by our emotions far more than we recognize. And so this becomes a really, really important assessment if you want to start looking at things holistically.
Very much so. Okay, so we're up to 3. Number 4, skills, or as we refer to them, competencies.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about what those are?
Well, I think it's sort of exciting. First of all, I did a search worldwide, and I found that virtually every country and every economy has tried to identify a set of workplace competencies that are sometimes called soft skills. They're not things you get a degree in. They're things that are there that you better have in place to do the job. And everybody is struggling to figure out what are the right ones, and it's really fascinating. So we did a complete search of the world, and that's in the appendices of the technical report. Mm-hmm. In here, we though took what my brother had put together and Dave Bonnstetter together, put originally 23 and then expanded to 25. These are competencies that are workplace related. And what's really fun about that is when you start to do a benchmark of a job, you need to identify not only the competency, the soft skills that are really, really required, but you better identify those that could handicap you in the job. And that's where the fun is to looking at the set of skills that if you have these skills and don't have a place to use them, it may not be a good relationship with the job.
Right. And how else do you really find that except for understanding these sciences? It's such an insightful tool. And then last but not least is acumen. And the way that I understand acumen and that I explain it to people is it's kind of like your snapshot or your perception of the world and how you show up in it. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's your belief, internal and external. So you have an internal view of the world. Each of us have our own view of reality, and then there's an external view of how you view the rest of the world. And the Hartman, again, it's really a deep assessment in many ways, and it's the hardest to understand because it really is looking at a psychological component that is, it's exciting, but also very deep.
It is. It is. And once you experience it, you kind of have one of those moments where you go, okay, how'd you learn all that about me? Oh, because you told me it, right? You told us that. We're just telling it back to you. So I want to go back just a little bit to, you mentioned the personal stories and the stories under the stories. And I think one of the things I really enjoyed about the book is, as you kind of shared, you talk a little bit about the history, and then you talk a little bit about its application. And Carissa, you come in at the end of each chapter and kind of wrap it all up and put it in these terms that we can understand when we're living in our day-to-day life. But Dr. Ron, there was part of the beginning where you really talk about some of the history of TTI and how we came to be. And it hit home a little bit for me because I'm a farm kid. And it's really the humble beginnings of how TTI was created. Can you talk to us a little bit about how that science that you discuss in this book and that we talk about in this organization came to life in a pickup truck in the middle of Iowa?
Well, first of all, Bill, my brother, is 12 years older than I. So, he was a senior in high school, and then he got stuck hauling me to kindergarten. And I remember him never really liking to take me to kindergarten. He wanted to take off and go to school, and then afterwards he could do anything he wanted. But so we had this 12-year gap, which meant that at times he got stuck with me even when he was older. And I do recall he had probably finished college, but I'm stuck with him for a weekend, and he's out looking at farms in a rural part of Iowa and photographing the farmstead, the lane, the layout of the buildings. And of course, what are you doing? I'm trying to figure out what I'm up to, and I'm just probably in middle school. And he's starting to explain to me that he has got a degree in marketing, and he's trying to help sales personnel understand that if they really were able to look at the things around a person, they could identify better how to sell to them. That they could short circuit the process by just knowing the kind of person and the behavior of that person. And I do remember going down one lane. He said, notice hollyhocks planted on the lane, all neatly mowed, little flowers all the way up. Now look at the farmstead, not a thing out of place. Everything is perfect. And I'm going, yeah. And then I'm going, yeah, we went to another farm that was really different. Like everything is a mess, and stuff that had been laid in the yard for maybe years and just never picked up. And that was fascinating. And I remember the third one, though, where he said, and here's Dad. So we go in. It's not real neat. I don't get it. And I look over there, and he says, see, there is a brand new John Deere tractor sitting over there. And everything else is a mess, but he had a brand new John Deere tractor. All of these he tied to DIS&C in meaningful ways. And it started to come alive for me. Like, yeah, that'd be cool that I could read people before they even open their mouth.
And now look at what's happened.
Yeah, we've done it a lot of that.
Pretty cool. It's pretty cool. Yeah. And Carissa, you're a little bit newer to the assessment space. Mm-hmm. So maybe your journey hasn't necessarily been traveling down a rural road looking at farms, but can you talk to us a little bit about how really diving deeper into these 5 sciences has maybe impacted the way that you go about your day?
Sure. I mean, as I said before, I really love learning about human behavior and why people do the things that they do. And so when I was brought on board here at TTI, of course I learned about our assessments and I learned about the results and the reports and maybe how to debrief people. But in the process of this book, I was able to actually go back to what laid the groundwork for each of the sciences. It just offered so much more depth to the sciences, a lot more kind of power behind them and knowing how to use them. And so now it's funny because sometimes when I go into a room, I feel like I'm reading things with a different lens almost, and I'm taking things in differently than I did before, especially before I got to TTI. But even now, after having written this book, it's given me a lot more knowledge to go off of in nearly every setting that I'm in.
Yeah, like you can't unsee it
Right.
or unknow it, right? Yeah, once you get to a certain point, oh no, I just noticed something about someone that I can't unsee, right? So you briefly touched on it, Carissa, but in your perspective, what makes the five sciences different or stand out from, another, I won't use names, but another assessment, that people might be more familiar with?
Sure. I think it really is just the depth of research that's gone into each one. As I mentioned before, just with motivators in particular, I mean, it starts off with going as far back as Plato and Socrates, and every contributor who's come since them has just sort of continued to stack the building blocks of each science. And then TTI has continued to build upon it as well, especially with what we've been doing in the Brain Lab and what we've contributed in those areas. So to me, having that much confidence in the foundation of the sciences really makes the results feel impactful and trustworthy.
She's pretty good.
I'm smiling thinking about just last week you were working on a file and I walked into the lab and I remember leaning over your shoulder and saying, I'm just enthralled that we can actually look at someone's brain while they're thinking and we can see how thinking takes place. And that's what she was doing in the lab, was making a report from one of our files.
Okay, so let's not beat around that bush any
Okay.
longer. So one of the special things, might I say, about TTI is that not only are we diving into the sciences of self, but we're marrying it with the brain. Who wants to tell us a little bit
I'm
about
going to start it, but
this
I'd like you to
special
think of a
place?
couple examples that might come to mind as we go through this. I'll back up to the point where I was an academic for 40 years. And as an academic, you have rules. And of course, academics are closer to God than other people. So they have a degree of arrogance associated with them. So when I started using the assessments, I really believed in them and I found value in them. And all my colleagues said they're self-reports. They're self-reports. You can say anything you want about yourself. And so I took that on as a challenge. And part of my research agenda for much of my academic career was trying to prove that these were real. And in the process, we started to realize that I could actually use EEG, an electroencephalograph, and I could get images of the brain while people are making decisions and see and correlate that to their decision. And so in every one of these chapters, we've snuck in a little section called response processing. And response processing shows some of our background data where we have improved our assessments and analyzed our assessments for how people were thinking when they answered it. And it's very exciting that you can literally answer the assessment by looking at images of the brain.
And there are images throughout the book. So
Yeah.
shameless plug, you have to buy the book to see it.
Yeah.
But there are actual images so that you can see exactly what you're
Well,
describing.
Dustin and I started working on this over a decade ago. And then Carissa came in. And originally what our plan was, I didn't realize she had all these skills in writing at that point. She was going to just, work in the lab. But you've had the privilege of bringing in even people that on this podcast, if I were to name their names, every one of you would know some of the people we've worked with because we've worked with some pretty famous people. But Carissa's had the privilege of actually hooking them up and collecting brain images while they're responding to stimuli. Anything come to mind that's unique from that experience that would come to mind right now?
Oh gosh, so many things. I think even just from my own personal experience, because I've had the cap put on as well and been able to see my own brain, which is incredibly cool. But even there's certain things that I chose for stimuli to pop up on the screen, things that maybe I thought I would have a very negative response to. And then in seeing my brain, because you can't outthink the technology, it's registering your responses before you register a conscious thought. And then seeing my brain flare in a way that was more neutral or more positive, it gave me a moment of realization saying, okay, well, maybe that particular item isn't so negative, or maybe I have gotten through that more than I initially thought that I did. So even just those moments when you're in the brain lab can be pretty profound.
And why should a random person on the street that just stumbled across this podcast, why should they care? I mean, can you talk to us a little bit? I've heard some anecdotal stories of how having that awareness has helped folks or change their perception. Can you talk to us a little bit about, when you marry that assessment science with the actual brain data, so what, I guess, is...
Yeah, I mean, we throw around the phrase sometimes here that seeing is believing. So, you might have a certain thought about how you behave or how you're going to respond to something, but when you actually see your brain imaging, it really makes it click in a different way than you might perceive without having seen that imaging. And I think it's important because not only is it self-discovery, but when you participate in something like this in a group setting or other people are also taking the assessments and getting results, there's just a different level of interaction you can have with those people. You have better empathy, you have better understanding for each other, you can work better together. So I don't think it's just about the self, I think it's about even just working on teams cohesively.
And it's not just the brain scanning, but the assessment themselves. You had talked about stories. I got involved in this. Bill had been running the business for a number of years, and I had my first position in a Research One institution. And so I started my classes, and the class didn't go real well. And so I ended up talking to Bill that weekend, and he said, well, have you used my assessments? And of course I hadn't. And so it really wasn't going well. So I used the assessments, and without going into a lot of detail, which you can get in Chapter 1, I would say that I had an aha that only would have come with assessments. In other words, there were gut level feelings. I knew it didn't work. I just didn't know why it wasn't working. And when I saw our group wheel with my entire class, all 25 students between 4 o'clock and 10 o'clock, and me at a solid 2 o'clock, I thought, there's something wrong with all of them. These are insights that assessments give you. Mm-hmm. They give you an opportunity to expose things that maybe there's no other way to expose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So going back to your story of, kind of trying to prove the academic world that this was legit, what do you say to skeptics? Because there may be some skeptics that even the title of the book, right? Sciences, the 5 sciences. Well, those aren't real sciences. So what could you share about the legitimacy, if
well, I
you
think
will?
both of us should, from our own perspectives, take a look at that one.
Yeah, I would say, primarily, again, it's just stemming from the research. The fact that we can have somebody take our assessment with a brain cap on that's showing how they're responding to the items. And it would even show if a certain item is confusing the person or if it's not written clearly. So we can also brush up assessments in that way where we can see the brain responding. And I think even that as the backing to an assessment shows that it is real. It's not something like you mentioned, Dr. Ron, just self-report, I can say whatever I want, because they're written in a way that is going to truly show who you are at your core.
Yeah, so we really have worked as a result of our work, and again, with the quantitative work done by the rest of our research team, we've been able to identify socially acceptable answers, and we systematically work those out of our assessments so that there are not obvious answers. And we really do stress people that they have to be, honest with themselves when they're answering these things. The other insight that I really hadn't thought about is when you're asking questions, you want to know what people like, and you also want to know what people don't like. And all of a sudden, when I looked at our brain data, we started to see a really, really strong reaction to what we don't like, more so than what we like. And in fact, when I correlated that with the results, when they paper and pencil filled it out, it was like 100%. Every time they told me something they didn't like, that was also in the paper and pencil. The brain and the paper and pencil matched like 100%. And so I got into the literature, and all of a sudden I'm running across this literature about the evolutionary development of humans is built on making sure you can survive. And so you have to be able to identify problems and bad things more so than good things. And it was it was just an exciting aha. And I'll give you another plug. It has nothing to do with us. Just read a great book called The Power of Bad. It's all about negative and you have to recognize it so it doesn't dominate you. And that's what a lot of our assessments do, is they give you recognition so that you can be proactive instead of reactive.
Yeah, somebody told me that, to your point, Carissa, of, seeing is believing. So I've been around this world for a lot longer than you have, Carissa. But one of the things that I think is just so, well, it's a science because we can prove it, you live it, is that when you understand yourself, then you better understand others. And then you kind of appreciate that difference in how it all works together. And so, in my, not going to say how many years of using these assessments and being in the business world, you can actually see progression if somebody's willing to put in the work, which I think you all have noticed in the Brain Lab as well. If you're willing to pay attention and put in the work, then you can actually see results.
You really can. Yeah, and that's maybe another podcast down the road, because what we originally started, the Brain Lab was opened up to have people take our assessments and gain insights on every single question.
So we're creating that validity.
Yes,
in that.
And that was just every one of our assessments. That's just part of the validation process, is running a group of people through the lab and gaining that information. Then over the years, we started to realize we could take another set of questions that were personally driven and capture what we're calling triggers and stressors. And then we could work with people to help them come up with skills to overcome that. So down the road, I would love to do another podcast on this new offering, really, that is the Mind Science Center, where we start with our assessments, we start with a brain scan, and then we systematically work with people in customized approach to have them gain skills and power over their brain that they've never had. And that's exciting. And we've seen the results, and it is exciting.
We will definitely take you up on that.
All right.
We'll make that happen. So I don't know how, but it's time. It's time to start wrapping up. So if you can leave our folks with one thing that you want them to remember about the 5 sciences, or as we've kind of been referring them to, the assessments, or to anything that we've talked about today, what's that one thing that you would want someone to take away from listening to our conversation today?
I think the one thing I would want people to take away is just that the intersection of all of these sciences is what creates that profound impact for somebody who chooses to go on that journey of self-discovery. I mean, if you understand how you behave in certain scenarios, you understand how you communicate with people, and then in turn you can modify those things based on what the environment calls for or based on what other people need from you, that's going to impact nearly every space of your life.
And Dr. Ron?
I would challenge everyone to do something that is really hard for me to do. I love to learn. And that falls under the heading of the term you used, self-awareness. So self-awareness is wonderful, but it's pretty worthless if you don't do something with it. So I would challenge people to go to the trouble to become more self-aware, only with the goal of being self-regulated.
That is the hard part.
To move it into practice. Yeah.
That's the hard part. But that's why we do this.
Yeah.
That's why we do this. All right. Well, thank you both so much for spending some time with us today. I'm sure folks took all kinds of little nuggets out of that conversation. And a shameless plug, you can get your copy of the 5 Sciences of Self from Amazon. And we encourage you to do so and dig in, because we just barely scraped the surface today. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you at our next episode.